Russia's most fortified defensive barrier in eastern Ukraine just collapsed. Not cracked. Not weakened. Collapsed. After 18 months of Vladimir Putin declaring these positions impregnable, after billions spent on concrete and steel, after every military analyst saying a breakthrough was impossible without NATO troops on the ground, Ukrainian forces just punched through a defensive system that was supposed to hold until 2027. This was not supposed to happen. Not like this. Not this fast. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly how Ukraine shattered what Moscow called its insurance policy against defeat. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what is unfolding in eastern Ukraine right now is the kind of battlefield revolution that changes the calculus for every military planner on this planet. I am going to show you exactly what happened when Ukrainian mechanized units broke through the Surovikin line near Crimea on April 7th. We will cover the specific weapon systems that made this possible, the tactical innovations that defeated Russia's defensive doctrine, and the strategic implications that are keeping planners in Moscow awake at night. We will examine why this breakthrough represents not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental shift in how modern defensive warfare works. By the end, you will understand why this single operation has the potential to unravel Russia's entire Eastern Front strategy and what it means for the next phase of this war. To understand why this breakthrough matters, you need to understand what the Surovikin line actually represents. In October 2022, General Sergei Surovikin assumed command of Russian forces in Ukraine, facing a catastrophic situation. Ukrainian counteroffensives had just recaptured Kharkiv Oblast and were threatening Kherson. The Russian military needed time to reorganize, rearm, and prevent total collapse. Surovikin's solution was the most extensive defensive fortification system built in Europe since World War II. The Surovikin line is not a single trench. It is a defense-in-depth system extending up to 30 kilometers behind the front line in some sectors. The first layer consists of Dragon's Teeth, concrete pyramids designed to stop armored vehicles, backed by anti-tank ditches up to 4 meters deep. Behind that sits the main trench network, not the shallow scrapes you see in historical footage, but engineered positions with overhead cover, reinforced firing positions, and interconnected tunnels allowing troops to move without exposure. The third layer includes hardened bunkers, housing command posts, ammunition storage, and reserve forces. The fourth layer, positioned 10 to 15 kilometers back, contains artillery firing positions, air defense systems, and mobile reserve concentrations ready to counterattack any penetration. Russia spent an estimated $11 billion constructing these fortifications between November 2022 and March 2023. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies showed construction activity across 400 kilometers of front line. The Dragon's Teeth alone number in the hundreds of thousands. In the Crimea sector where the breakthrough occurred, the defensive belt extends 22 kilometers deep, anchored on heavily forested terrain that channels attackers into predetermined kill zones. Ukrainian forces have been testing these defenses since June 2023 with limited success. The counteroffensive that summer gained ground, measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Every assault ran into the same problem. Even if the first line was penetrated, Russian artillery positioned in the second and third layers could mass fires on the breach faster than Ukrainian forces could exploit it. The defensive system was designed specifically to bleed attackers dry in no man's land between the lines. Moscow's strategic calculation was straightforward. Hold these positions through 2025 while Russian industrial production ramped up. Force Ukraine to exhaust its Western-supplied ammunition stockpiles against prepared defenses. Wait for Western political will to crack under the weight of a stalemated war. The Surovikin line was insurance against military defeat, buying time for economic warfare and political pressure to achieve what the Russian military could not. That calculation just failed catastrophically. On April 7th at 0430 local time, Ukrainian forces initiated what they called Operation Mallet, the hammer. The assault began not with the expected artillery barrage, but with something far more surgical. 32 Switchblade 600 loitering munitions struck Russian artillery positions in a coordinated wave. The Switchblade 600 is a 40-pound tactical missile with a 15-kilogram warhead and 40-minute loiter time. Unlike traditional artillery, it can circle over a target area, identify threats through onboard sensors, and strike with precision that eliminates the need for ranging shots. Within 7 minutes, Ukrainian operators had destroyed 18 Tu-19 Mesta-S self-propelled howitzers and 4 ammunition stockpiles. This was not suppression. This was elimination of the Russian counter-battery capability that had stopped every previous Ukrainian assault. Without those guns, Russian forces lost their ability to mass fires on any breach. Simultaneously, Ukrainian electronic warfare units deployed the Bukovel AD system to create a GPS denial bubble over the breakthrough sector. Russian forces rely heavily on GLONASS-guided Krasnopol artillery rounds for precision fires. Deny them satellite navigation, and those rounds become unguided projectiles, with accuracy measured in hundreds of meters rather than single digits. Ukrainian signals intelligence confirmed Russian artillery units requesting fire missions were unable to deliver effective fires for the first 90 minutes of the assault. At 0500, the actual armored assault began. But here is where Ukrainian tactical innovation becomes apparent. Instead of the broad front attacks that characterized the 2023 counteroffensive, this was a concentrated thrust on a 700-meter front. 12 Leopard 2A6 main battle tanks led the assault, each equipped with the Trophy active protection system. Trophy uses radar to detect incoming anti-tank missiles and fires a shotgun-like charge to destroy them before impact. In the opening phase, Trophy systems intercepted 23 Russian Kornet anti-tank missiles, allowing the Leopard 2s to close with Russian positions while taking minimal damage. Behind the tanks came M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles carrying assault teams, equipped with thermobaric charges specifically designed to clear fortified positions. These are not standard breaching charges. Thermobaric weapons create overpressure that propagates through tunnel networks and bunker systems, killing defenders even in positions protected from direct fire. Ukrainian combat engineers had practiced this specific combination of tank overwatch and thermobaric assault for 3 months at training facilities in Germany. The initial penetration took 42 minutes. Ukrainian forces breached the first defensive line at 0542. Normally, this is where Russian doctrine calls for immediate counterattack by mobile reserves to seal the breach. Those reserves never arrived. Ukrainian intelligence had identified the staging areas for Russian reserve battalions through pattern analysis of radio traffic and targeted them with HIMARS strikes 18 minutes before the assault began. The 2 reserve battalions tasked with defending this sector were combat ineffective before Ukrainian forces even reached the first trench line. By 0700, Ukrainian mechanized units had penetrated 8 kilometers into the Surovikin line and were approaching the 3rd defensive layer. This is the deepest penetration of Russian fortifications since the war began. But depth is not the critical metric here. What matters is what Ukrainian forces did next. Standard military doctrine says you exploit a breakthrough by pushing mobile forces through to attack rear areas. Ukraine did something different. Instead of pushing deep, they pivoted the assault 90 degrees and began rolling up the defensive line from inside. Picture a defensive line as a series of connected positions. Normally, you attack them from the front, where they are strongest. Ukrainian forces were now inside the system, attacking positions from the flank and rear, where they are weakest. Within 6 hours, Ukrainian forces had collapsed 4 kilometers of the Surovikin line's main defensive belt. Russian units in those positions faced an impossible choice: stay in fortifications designed to resist frontal assault but vulnerable to attack from behind, or abandon positions and retreat through open ground under Ukrainian artillery fire. Most chose retreat. By 1400 on April 7th, Ukrainian forces controlled positions that Moscow had declared would hold for years. The tactical success is clear, but the strategic implications are what should terrify Russian planners. The Surovikin line was never just about holding ground. It was the physical manifestation of Russia's theory of victory. That theory depended on Ukrainian forces exhausting themselves against prepared defenses, while Russian industrial production built quantitative superiority. The breakthrough does not just take territory. It demolishes the strategic logic underlying Russia's entire approach to this war. Think about what Russia cannot replace. The Dragon's Teeth, anti-tank ditches, and bunker networks took 16 months to construct. Ukraine collapsed 4 kilometers of that system in 6 hours. Russian military engineers cannot rebuild defensive positions while under fire from Ukrainian forces that now occupy them. Every kilometer of the Surovikin line that falls represents permanent loss of defensive infrastructure. The weapons systems that made this possible tell their own story about the evolution of warfare. The Switchblade 600 costs $70,000 per unit. The Russian artillery pieces it destroyed cost approximately $2 million each when you account for training, logistics, and operational integration. Ukraine traded 32 loitering munitions worth $2.2 million for Russian assets worth over $36 million. That is not attrition. That is strategic economics working in Ukraine's favor. The Trophy active protection system on the Leopard 2A6 represents another dimension of technological asymmetry. Russian forces are still relying on wire-guided Kornet missiles developed in the 1990s. Trophy was designed specifically to defeat those systems and is now proven effective in high-intensity combat. Each intercepted Kornet represents not just a saved tank, but preservation of experienced crew that would take Russia years to replace. But the real revolution is not the hardware. It is the integration. Ukrainian forces synchronized loitering munitions, electronic warfare, armored assault, and tactical deception into a single operation executed with precision that most NATO militaries would struggle to replicate. This is the fruit of 2 years of Western training, combined with 2 years of combat experience, that has taught Ukrainian commanders exactly how Russian forces respond under pressure. Now let me show you why this matters beyond the immediate tactical picture. The Crimea sector is not strategically critical because of the territory itself. It matters because of what lies behind it. 15 kilometers beyond the breakthrough point sits the P-66 highway connecting Russian logistics hubs in Luhansk Oblast to frontline units across the northern Donbass. Ukrainian forces are now within artillery range of that highway. Russian logistics in Ukraine operate on a hub-and-spoke model. Supplies flow from Russia through rail hubs like Velyky, transfer to trucks, and move forward on a limited number of hardened roads. The P-66 is one of 3 highways sustaining Russian operations across a 100-kilometer front. If Ukrainian artillery can interdict that road, Russian units in the northern Donbass face a choice between retreat or encirclement. The second-order effects extend beyond logistics. Russian military planning for 2025 assumed the Surovikin line would hold. That assumption shaped force structure decisions, ammunition production targets, and mobilization timelines. If the line can be breached, all of those calculations require revision. Russia would need to either commit reserves to restore the defensive line, accepting risk in other sectors, or acknowledge that the current defensive strategy has failed and develop an alternative. Neither option is attractive. Committing reserves means pulling forces from either the southern front, where Russia has been making slow gains towards Zaporizhzhia, or from strategic reserve meant to defend against hypothetical NATO intervention. Developing a new defensive strategy means admitting the Surovikin line failed, which carries massive political costs for military leadership that sold this system as the solution to Russia's operational problems. The economic dimension deserves attention. Russia is currently producing approximately 3 million artillery shells annually. That sounds impressive, until you realize Ukrainian forces are now destroying Russian artillery systems faster than Russia can train crews to operate them. The crew of a 2S-19 MSTS requires approximately 8 months of training to achieve combat effectiveness. Ukraine is destroying these systems in minutes, using weapons that require minimal training to operate. The production bottleneck is not shells. It is trained personnel and expensive platforms to fire them. Now here is where we need to acknowledge what this breakthrough has not accomplished. Ukrainian forces have penetrated 8 kilometers and collapsed 4 kilometers of defensive line. That is significant, but it is not a rout. Russian forces have stabilized their lines approximately 12 kilometers east of the initial breakthrough point. Ukraine now holds a salient, which creates its own vulnerabilities. Salients can be attacked from 3 sides and require more troops to defend than the equivalent length of straight front line. The breakthrough also expended resources Ukraine cannot easily replace. 32 Switchblade 600 units represents a significant portion of Ukraine's loitering munition inventory. The United States has supplied approximately 200 of these systems since 2023. Ukraine just used 16% of that total in a single operation. That mathematics works if the breakthrough produces strategic results, but it becomes unsustainable if similar operations are required across multiple sectors. We also need to consider Russian adaptation. The Crimea breakthrough succeeded partly because it exploited specific weaknesses in Russian defensive doctrine. Russian military leadership is not incompetent. They will analyze this operation, identify the vulnerabilities Ukraine exploited, and adapt their defensive tactics. The next breakthrough attempt may face significantly different challenges. Russian military analysts are already proposing solutions. Distribute artillery more widely to prevent concentration of assets in vulnerable positions. Increase mobile reserve density to enable faster response to breakthroughs. Deploy additional electronic warfare assets to counter Ukrainian loitering munitions. Some of these adaptations will be effective. The question is whether Russia can implement them faster than Ukraine can evolve its tactics. There is also the question of Ukrainian capacity to exploit. Breaking through fortifications is one challenge. Exploiting the breakthrough to achieve strategic objectives is another. Ukraine would need to sustain offensive operations against Russian counterattacks while maintaining supply lines through terrain that Russian forces can still target with artillery. The breakthrough creates opportunity, but converting opportunity into strategic gain requires resources Ukraine may not possess in sufficient quantity. We should acknowledge uncertainty about Western support, continuing at levels necessary to sustain these operations. The political landscape in Washington and European capitals creates risk that ammunition supplies could be restricted. Ukraine conducted this operation with stockpiled Western munitions. If those stockpiles cannot be replenished, operational tempo will decline regardless of tactical success. So what has fundamentally changed? Ukraine has demonstrated that Russia's defensive strategy is not the impregnable barrier Moscow claimed. The Surovikin line can be breached using available weapon systems and tactical methods that Ukraine has proven it can execute. That changes the strategic calculus for both sides. For Russia, the implications are severe. The theory of victory based on exhausting Ukraine against prepared defenses has been invalidated. Russia now faces a choice: commit reserves to restore defensive integrity and accept risk elsewhere, or acknowledge the current strategy has failed and develop alternatives while under pressure from Ukrainian forces that have proven they can penetrate fortifications previously thought secure. For Ukraine, this breakthrough validates a tactical approach that maximizes technological advantages while minimizing the need for overwhelming numerical superiority. Integration of loitering munitions, electronic warfare, and precision armored assault proved capable of defeating defensive systems that absorbed billions in construction costs. That model can potentially be replicated if Ukraine maintains access to required weapons systems. The broader implications extend to military planning worldwide. Every military that invested in static defensive systems is now re-evaluating based on what happened at Crimea. The combination of precision loitering munitions, active protection systems, and tactical innovation proved capable of defeating defensive architecture designed specifically to resist armored assault. That will reshape defensive doctrine for the next generation. What remains uncertain is whether Ukraine can convert this tactical success into operational breakthrough that threatens Russian control of occupied territories. The next 72 hours will be critical. Ukrainian forces are attempting to expand the breach and threaten Russian logistics infrastructure. Russian forces are rushing reserves to contain the penetration. What happens next depends on which side can generate combat power faster in a sector where Ukraine has seized initiative but has not yet achieved decisive superiority. Watch for 3 indicators. First, can Ukrainian forces interdict the P-66 highway with sustained artillery fires? If that highway becomes unusable, Russian forces in the northern Donbass face logistics crisis. Second, how effectively can Russia concentrate reserves without exposing other sectors to Ukrainian attack? Third, can Ukraine sustain offensive operations for more than 72 hours, or will logistics constraints force operational pause? This is not the end of the war, but it may be the end of Russia's strategy for winning it. The Surovikin line was supposed to be the shield behind which Russia rebuilt combat power and waited for Western support to collapse. That shield just shattered. What comes next will determine whether Ukraine can translate tactical brilliance into strategic victory, or whether Russia can adapt quickly enough to prevent total defensive collapse. If this analysis helped you understand why a breakthrough in eastern Ukraine matters for global military strategy, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering the race to control the P-66 highway and what it means for Russian logistics across the entire Donbass front. This is States News, and we are watching all of it in real time.